Hey guys, I'm Pat, and in today's video we'll be going over if statements and conditions. You might notice that the studio looks a little bit different than the previous videos. Roblox recently updated their icons in studio. I'm not too big of a fan of how the Explorer looks really. These icons over here are kind of ugly, and like how would you describe it, like oversaturated or undersaturated, I don't know, but see how like they're faded kind of, it's kind of weird. But these icons up here aren't too bad, but it's the Explorer icons that are kind of ugly and confusing, but it's not too important for this video. So what we're going to do is we're going to put a script into the server script service, and that's what we're going to start off with. So an if statement is a way, or we'll start with like describing conditions. A condition would be a way to check if something is true or false. So you would use it to maybe compare two numbers to see if one's bigger than another or if they're equal to each other. A way that you could imagine that being used in Roblox or an actual game would be like comparing distance between two parts, or you know, checking to see if a player said a certain word in chat or something like that, right? You would use an if statement, and the condition would be the way that you check inside that if statement. So the reason we call it an if statement is because we just write if. So here, I'll just write it. So we're just gonna make a quick variable called condition. It's gonna be Boolean. We're gonna set the false. This isn't too important, it's just placeholder for now. So what we can do inside our if statement is the first thing we put is obviously if, and then we hit space, and then after that we put our condition. So you can see when we create a variable, we use the single equals as an assignment operator, so it assigns the value on the right to the variable on the left, right? But when we're using double equals, that's comparison, so we're comparing the two variables to see if the variable on the left is equal to the variable on the right. So there are two different symbols, and when you're using an if statement, you should make sure that you're using double equals if you're checking to see if they're equal to each other. And we can also do, well, this is just a false, right? So a condition can either be true or false, or a Boolean, right? So if we get rid of this, this will actually work this way as well, if condition then, and it reads a lot more kind of like English this way. And what it's doing is it's checking to see if condition is true. So our condition, this is just a variable name, but the thing that you would actually put here is a condition, right? And what the if statement is doing is it's checking to see if that condition is true. So if the Boolean, we can just put a Boolean there, just the same, and if that Boolean is true, then the code inside the if statement will still run. So you can see, once we made the if statement, it automatically indented our cursor in. So it tabbed it over 5 spaces, or I guess it's 4 in studio, I don't know, but you can see we're over roughly 5 spaces, so we indented. That's just a tab press, and this is called a block of code here. So we're inside the if statement, so in between this header here, the if condition, and the end, we will be indented over 1, and we will be inside this if statement. Usually it's much more organized like this. I think you can do this without indentation, but it's kind of ugly and it's a lot harder to read, so much better to indent. And yeah, so once you're inside an if statement, you know, there'll be an indentation, and if this condition is true, this if statement checks to see if the condition is true, then it will execute, or it'll run the code inside. If the condition is false, then it'll just completely ignore everything that's here. I'll just skip over it and continue on running the script, right? We can also do an else. So what an else is in case this condition fails, like this condition is false up here, then it'll go to the else, and it'll run whatever is inside the else, right? So it'll ignore this first part that's up here, and it'll go down to the else, and it'll run the code that's down here instead, right? So I want to elaborate a little bit more on conditions and what you can compare stuff. So we're going to make two variables. So we're going to make a variable called x, and we're going to make that 6, and we'll make a variable called y, and we'll make it 10. So now we can check if x equals y, right? So if x equals y, then it'll complete this code in here. Obviously x does not equal y, so we'll skip that, and instead I'll go to the else. If there's not an else here, I'll just continue on, right? We can also check to see if x is less than y. X is less than y, so it actually would do the code in here, and then it would skip over the else, so it would ignore the else. We can also check if it's greater than with the greater than symbol, and we can also do less than or equal to with the combination of equal to and less than in the same way with the other one. We can also do not equal to with like the tilde or like the curly line, whatever you want to call it, and then equal. So if x does not equal y, then it'll do the code in here. That's what that little curly means. It means not, basically. You can also, instead of doing that little curly, you can just type the word not and hit space. And you gotta put parentheses here after you do that for some reason, but you can do not, and then what it'll do is whatever the result of this condition here is inside the parentheses, it will reverse that. So if this condition is false, it'll reverse it and it'll give true. And if it's true, it'll reverse that and it'll give false, right? And we can also do stuff like combine conditions with words like and or. So we can use if x equals y or x is less than y. So what it'll do is it'll check this first condition. So if x is equal to y, and if that is false, then it'll move on to the condition after the next or, which would be x is less than y. And if that's true, then it'll still give true, and it'll stop going on with the ors. And then we can also use and what and will do is it'll check to see if both conditions on the left and the right are correct. So if x equals y and x is less than y, then it'll give true. Obviously this will never be true because x can't equal y and be less than y, but you get the idea. It's just kind of an example, right? So that's how you compare numbers in like a condition like this. What we can do is we can also have an else if, which is, I think it's, no, it's combined. So you put else if combined like this. If you have a space in between here, then it'll think you're creating another if statement here inside this else, which is most of the time not what you want to do. So we'll just do an else if, right? And that way it knows that it's an else if. So what an else if is you can add like a second condition. So if this first condition up here gives false, then it'll move on to this else if, and it'll check the condition inside this else if. And if that's still false, it'll continue on. If it's true, it'll run the code inside the else if, right? So what we'll do is we'll just make like just like some sample code. So in case like you're having a hard time understanding, we can you know, give like a visual. So x equals 1. So if x is equal to y and x is less than y, then it'll print that pretty much in the words. And if x is less than y, then it'll print that instead. So let's go ahead and test it, and we'll look in the output. X is less than y is what we got in the output, because you know it checks this up here. It sees that this is obviously false, they can't be equal to each other, and you know less than, and then it goes to this and it says x is less than y, so we'll do this. And now what we'll do is I'll show you what happens if nothing's true, right? So if nothing's true, I don't know why I hid the output, it's kind of an instinct. nothing's true, you see it prints out nothing because the prints are only inside the if statements. We can actually go ahead and put a print out here, just signifying that the code is ended, and we can run it again and we can see it only prints out the end of code. I ran it the wrong way, but it doesn't matter. So you can see it only printed out the end of the code because these two are false. If we change this back to less than, then you can see it prints out x is less than y, and then it also prints out the end of the code. So it will continue on after it runs the code inside here just the same. If we want, you know, to check if, do something, if all these conditions end up being false, we can print, you know, we can do an else, and then we can do that, right? So you'll see once we run this, we get x is less than y. It doesn't print this part because it skips this after it finds out that this is true, right? So this is actually better than having multiple if statements. If you have, you know, if we replace this with another if statement and we had like an end here, what it would do is it would check this, and then it would check this, and then it would, if that's false, then it'd still do else, right? But the thing is, if this was true, then it would check this after, even though it didn't need to necessarily. Most of the time, you know, you won't need to do this. Like, you won't need to have it check this and check this. You'll either need to check this, and then you'll have like a second condition to be checked in case this is false, right? So you want to use an else if because as far as optimization goes, and you know, your code running smoothly, making good performance, you want to use an else if because doing it this way, it'll check multiple times rather than just skipping over the rest of the code if the first condition is true or whatever, right? So that's something you want to keep in mind when you're using if statements. You also see this little arrow here. If you hit this arrow, you'll see, and it'll actually hide the block of code that's associated with this head here. So that way, you know, we can read over our code a little bit easier. If we have a lot of code and we want to hide blocks of code, we can do that. And then one more thing we can see is we can actually put the if statements inside of each other. So we'll put this back to this. If x is less than y and y, or x is less than 5. So we can also do it like this, right? We can put numbers in here too. And actually what we'll do is we'll do this. So you'll notice that now we have a math operation in here. So what it'll do is it'll always complete any math before it does the comparison. So it'll do 5 plus 1, that'll be 6. And then it'll check to see if x is less than 6 and x isn't less than 6. So we'll print here. So now we'll go ahead and run this as a test here, and we'll see what we get in the output. We get x is less than y, and it doesn't print this because it checked that and it realized that it's false. But what we can do is we can add an equal sign here to see if x is less than or equal to 6 or 5 plus 1. And then once we run it, you'll see we get both in the output. Usually, you won't want to really nest if statements like this. Instead of this, we could put an and here to check if both conditions are true, and then we can run the code inside of here. But you can see we're trying to print 2 different conditions here, so technically we don't really want to do that. But if you were trying to check like this, then this second if statement would be kind of unnecessary, and then you'd have 2 indentations, so your code is kind of being pushed over a little far to the right, and it's kind of pointless like that. You could just put an and in here in this first if statement, and it'll clean up your code a little bit, and it'll have less indentation, it'll look a little bit better. Just something to keep in mind. So one more thing I would like to go over is nil. So we'll go ahead and make y nil. So what is nil? Nil is actually its own data type technically, I'm pretty sure. It's basically representing empty data. It basically means that there's nothing. It just literally means nothing, right? And nil will also is the equivalent of being false. So if you check it in a condition, nil will always give false. But you see, we're checking to see if x is less than nil. So if we go ahead and run it, I did the wrong run, but you'll see we actually got an error. If we click the error, it takes us to the line of code that gave the error. And it says attempt to compare number is less than nil. So x is a number, and y is not a number, it's nil. It's its own data type, right? So it's giving an error because you can't compare a number to nothing, right? So we're going to go ahead and fix this. And we're just going to check to see if y. So if y is true, then, so basically what this will do is it'll check to see if there's data inside of y. And if there isn't, like the data is nil, then it will skip over this. So I'm going to just print. So this is a way of checking to see if there's actual data stored inside of a variable. So if we go ahead and run this, you'll see it doesn't print because there's nothing inside of y. Now if we also do something like this, where we defined y, but we never assigned it a value, you'll see we actually do get an underline here. Initialize it with nil to sign. So y doesn't get initialized nil on its own. If you want to initialize it nil, you had to manually type it out. But if you don't ever give it any data at all, it won't even have nil inside of it. It'll just throw an error. So that's something you need to, it's just something to keep in mind, right? And that's actually pretty much all I really wanted to go over for this video. If statements aren't too complicated, really all it is it's just checking to see if, it's just comparing things, checking to see if something's true or not. It's very useful, definitely one of the fundamentals you need to know for programming, very important. And it also kind of introduces you to indentation, code blocks, kind of like that. Next video, we'll be going over functions, which are a way of like complementing if statements. Kind of like functions are very useful in code, and a lot of people misuse them, and a lot of beginners misuse them and don't see like the proper purpose behind them. So it's kind of common for people to not understand what functions are useful for, but I'll try and explain it in the next video. And if you don't understand, when you get further into scripting, I'm sure you'll find good uses for it. So that's it for this video. I'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks for watching, whatever. Bye.